I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just sat there in that lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon in November, watching my mother-in-law fold her hands on the mahogany table like she was already the queen of everything my husband's father had built. And I thought, she has no idea what's inside that second envelope. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Simone Thibodeau. I'm 32 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of city where people work hard and don't expect anyone to hand them anything. My mother was a school secretary. My father drove a delivery truck for 23 years until his back gave out. We weren't poor, but we understood the weight of money, what it cost to earn it, and what it meant to lose it. That understanding shaped me in ways I didn't fully appreciate until I married into the Marchetti family. I met my husband, Daniel, at a conference in Toronto when I was 25. He was warm in a way that surprised me, considering where he came from. He laughed easily. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. On our third date, he told me his mother could be a lot, and I smiled because I thought I understood what that meant. I did not understand what that meant. His mother's name is Rosaria Marchetti. She was 64 at the time of the will reading. She had grown up in a small town outside of Hamilton, married into modest circumstances, and then watched her husband, Franco, build a commercial real estate business from essentially nothing over 40 years. By the time I came into the picture, the Marchetti name meant something in their community. Franco owned 4 commercial properties across northern Ontario. He was respected. He was generous. He was, in private, a man who saw his wife very clearly and had quietly made peace with what he saw. Rosaria saw me as a problem from the beginning. It wasn't something she ever said outright. That wasn't her style. Her style was the slightly too long pause after you spoke, as if she needed a moment to recover from whatever inadequacy you had just displayed. It was the way she'd compliment my cooking and then add, though Franco always liked his sauce a little thicker. It was the way she referred to Daniel's previous girlfriend, a woman he had dated for 3 months 6 years before we met, as that lovely Juliana, at least once per family dinner for the first 2 years of our marriage. Daniel and I got married in the summer when I was 27. It was a beautiful wedding. My parents drove down from Sudbury. Franco Marchetti danced with me at the reception and whispered that I was exactly what his son needed, and I felt, in that moment, genuinely welcomed. Rosaria gave a toast that was technically warm and somehow made me feel like a guest in my own marriage. We settled in North Bay. Daniel ran operations for his father's business. I worked as a project coordinator for a construction firm. We bought a small house on a street with old maple trees and neighbors who waved from their driveways. For a while, things were fine, or at least, what passes for fine when you have a mother-in-law who treats your presence in the family like a stain she hasn't found the right cleaner for yet. The issue of children came up within the first year. I want to be careful about how I say this, because it still carries weight. Daniel and I had tried. We had tried for a long time. There were appointments and tests and conversations in clinical offices where the lighting was too bright and the chairs were too stiff. There were 2 losses, early ones, that we grieved privately because we weren't ready to explain them to anyone. What we eventually learned was that carrying a pregnancy to term would be very difficult for me, and that if we wanted to become parents, we would likely need to explore other paths. We were still in the middle of that exploration, still figuring out what we wanted and what we could carry when Rosaria began making the comments. They were never direct. They were the kind of comments that, if you repeated them to someone else, might sound almost innocent. Daniel was always such a natural with children, even as a boy. Franco always hoped for grandchildren to pass the business to. It must be hard, Simone, to keep working those long hours, though I suppose it's easier when you don't have little ones waiting at home. I said nothing. Every time, I said nothing. I would feel Daniel's hand find mine under the table, and I would hold it, and I would say nothing. Franco never made those comments. Franco, who I now understood had been watching all of this for years, would redirect the conversation. He would ask Daniel about a project, or ask me something about my work, or simply begin telling a story from his own past that required everyone's attention. He was smooth about it, kind, and I think he saw, in those moments of redirection, something he needed to address before he no longer could. Franco was diagnosed with a heart condition when I was 29. He was 71. He managed it for over a year with medication and lifestyle changes, and then one evening in late autumn, he had a cardiac event at home and was gone before the ambulance arrived. It was sudden, even when it wasn't. Daniel was devastated. I held him through the worst of it and tried to be whatever he needed. Rosaria, in grief, became harder in a way I hadn't thought possible. She leaned into the family property and legacy with an intensity that felt less like mourning and more like fortification. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. In the days leading up to it, Rosaria said something to me that I have thought about many times since. We were at the family home in Sturgeon Falls, going through some of Franco's things at Rosaria's request, or rather, at her direction, since she stood in the doorway of his study, giving instructions, while Daniel and I did the actual sorting. At some point she looked at me, and in a tone that carried the full weight of everything she'd never directly said, she told me, "This family's legacy belongs to its blood, Simone. Franco would have wanted it that way." I looked at her. I didn't say anything. I set down the folder I was holding, and I went to find Daniel in the next room, and I stood beside him quietly while I thought about a conversation I had had with Franco 14 months earlier, on a Thursday afternoon, when he had called me, not Daniel, me, and asked if I could meet him at his office. Let me go back to that Thursday. It was an ordinary day in September of the year before he died. I remember I had to leave a site meeting early to make it to his office by 3. Franco was already there when I arrived, sitting behind his desk, but he came around it when I walked in and pointed me toward the sitting area by the window instead. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the carafe on the credenza. He handed me one, and he sat down across from me and he said, "I need to talk to you about something I've been thinking about for a while." I remember wrapping both hands around the mug. It was a cool day. The window behind him showed a stretch of gray sky over the parking lot. He asked me, first, how I was really doing. Not the family dinner version of that question. The real one. And I don't know exactly why, maybe because he asked it so plainly, maybe because I was tired, maybe because Franco had always had a way of making you feel like the truth was safe with him, but I told him. I told him about the losses. I told him about the appointments. I told him that Daniel and I were still deciding what came next, and that it was hard, and that the comments from Rosaria made it harder in ways I couldn't fully explain to Daniel without making him feel caught between us. Franco listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She has always been afraid of women who don't need her approval. It makes her mean. That's not your fault, and it's not something you can fix." He paused. Then he said, "I've been doing some thinking about the future, about what's fair, and I want to do something while I still can, because I've learned not to trust later as much as I used to." He told me he wanted to transfer ownership of one of his commercial properties to me directly, not to Daniel, to me, in my name. It was the building on Commerce Drive in North Bay, a mid-sized retail and office complex that had been fully leased for 11 years. He said he had spoken to his lawyer and that it was within his rights to do so as a gift. He said he wanted it documented cleanly, registered properly, and done before anything could complicate it. I told him I couldn't accept that. He told me to stop being polite and listen. He said, "Simone, I have watched you show up for my son and for this family for 5 years. I have watched you absorb things that no one should have to absorb quietly. I have watched you work and contribute and love my son without asking for recognition. What I am giving you is not charity, it is acknowledgement. And it is protection, because I know my wife, and I know what she will try to do when I am no longer here to prevent it." I sat with that for a long time. Eventually, I said yes. The transfer was processed through his lawyer, a man named Gerald Firth who had handled Franco's business affairs for over 20 years. The deed was signed. The property was registered in my name with the Land Registry Office. Franco gave me a copy of every document in a plain manila envelope and told me to keep it somewhere safe and private. I brought it home. I put it in the filing cabinet in our home office, behind a folder labeled insurance vehicle, where I was confident no one would ever look by accident. I told Daniel 3 weeks later. I sat him down in our kitchen on a Sunday morning with coffee, and I told him everything, the meeting, the conversation, the transfer, all of it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He never told me he was going to do that." And I said, "I don't think he wanted it to be complicated by other opinions before it was done." Daniel thought about that. Then he nodded slowly and said, "That sounds like him." We agreed, together, not to raise it with Rosaria. Not yet. There would be a time for it, and Franco's formal will reading would clarify the rest of the estate's distribution. The property on Commerce Drive was already mine, legally and cleanly. There was no urgency to announce it. Then Franco died. And the weeks that followed were grief and logistics and casseroles brought by neighbors and phone calls that needed returning. And then it was November, and we were sitting around a table in Gerald Firth's office in Sturgeon Falls. The room was small for the number of people in it. There was Rosaria, in black, sitting very straight. There was Daniel beside me, his knee pressed against mine under the table. There were Franco's two sisters, Carmela and Louisa, who had driven up from Hamilton. There was Gerald Firth himself, silver-haired and deliberate, with a brown folder open in front of him. And there was me. Rosaria had, I noticed, brought her own notebook. She held a pen. She looked like a woman preparing to inventory what was owed to her. Gerald began with the standard explanations, the nature of the document, the date it was executed, the process we would follow. Then he began reading. The bulk of the estate was straightforward. The family home in Sturgeon Falls went to Rosaria. The business accounts and operating assets of the company went into a trust to be managed jointly by Daniel and a named accountant, with income distributed to Rosaria during her lifetime, and the principal reverting to Daniel thereafter. Personal effects were divided, with specific care, certain items to Carmela and Louisa, certain pieces to Daniel, a watch that had belonged to Franco's father, itemized by name. Rosaria was writing things down. She looked satisfied. She looked like a woman who had already known what the document would say and was simply confirming it. Then Gerald looked up and said, "There is one additional matter addressed in a separate instrument, executed 14 months prior to the primary will. This concerns a property transfer that was completed during Mr. Will Marchetti's lifetime and therefore falls outside the estate. I'm including it here for the record and for the clarity of all parties." He opened a second folder. He said, "The commercial property located at Commerce Drive, North Bay, was transferred via registered deed to Simone Thibodeau Marchetti on September 28th of last year. This transfer was completed in full, registered with the Land Registry Office, and constitutes an irrevocable gift. It is not part of the estate. It belongs to Mrs. Thibodeau Marchetti outright." The room was very quiet. I kept my eyes on Gerald's folder. I heard Rosaria's pen stop moving. Carmela made a small sound. Louisa looked at the table. Daniel's knee pressed a little harder against mine, and I felt his hand find mine beneath the edge of the table, and I held it. Rosaria said, "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Gerald repeated it. Calmly. With the particular steadiness of a man who had been a lawyer for a long time and had sat in rooms like this before. Rosaria said, "That can't be right. Franco would have told me." Gerald said, "Mr. Marchetti was under no legal obligation to disclose personal gift transactions. The transfer was properly executed and registered. I was present for the signing." Rosaria turned to look at me. I looked back at her. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I just held her gaze the way I had learned to, over 5 years of dinners, and redirected conversations and comments, shaped like compliments. She said, "This is Franco, would not have done this without speaking to me. This is not what he would have wanted." And something shifted in me, quietly, like a door closing on a draft. Because I heard, in those words, exactly what she had said in the study in Sturgeon Falls 3 weeks earlier. This family's legacy belongs to its blood. And I thought of Franco, sitting across from me with a cup of coffee on a gray September afternoon, saying, "I know my wife, and I know what she will try to do when I am no longer here to prevent it." He had known. He had simply made sure it didn't matter. I said, quietly. He did what he believed was right. I think that's all any of us can do. Rosaria looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at her steadily and said, Mom, this is done. She looked back at me. There was something in her face I hadn't seen before, not the controlled disdain, not the polished management of appearances, something raw, something that looked, if I'm being honest, a great deal like the moment a person realizes they misread a situation entirely and cannot go back. She gathered her notebook. She said she needed some air. She walked out. Carmela watched her go, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. She said, Franco loved you. I hope you know that. I said I did. The rest of the meeting was procedural. Gerald walked us through the remaining items. Daniel was composed, focused, asking the right questions. I sat beside him and thought about Commerce Drive and the 11 leased units and the fact that for 14 months I had driven past that building on my way to work without ever mentioning it to anyone except my husband, and now it was officially, publicly, unambiguously, mine. The drive home took 40 minutes. Daniel drove. I watched the highway and the dark tree line and the occasional lit sign for a gas station or a rest stop. Halfway home, Daniel reached across and took my hand on the center console and didn't let go for the rest of the drive. When we got home, I made tea. He sat at the kitchen table and I sat across from him, and he said, How are you feeling? I said, I don't know yet. I think I need a few days to figure that out. He said, He really did love you. That was his way of saying it, you know that, right? He wasn't a man who said things easily. He did things. I thought about the gray sky through the office window, the 2 cups of coffee, the quiet way he had said, I've learned not to trust later as much as I used to. I know, I said. I knew it then too. That's why I said yes. We sat with that for a while. In the weeks that followed, Rosaria did not call. She did not come to North Bay. Carmela sent me a message that was short but kind. Daniel spoke to his mother twice on the phone, brief conversations that he summarized afterward with a kind of exhausted pragmatism. She was not happy. She felt blindsided. She was talking to her own lawyer. Her lawyer, as it turned out, confirmed what Gerald had already told her. The transfer was clean, registered, and legally sound. There was nothing to contest. Franco had made his decision with full legal capacity, 14 months before his death, with his own counsel present. It was done. I want to be honest about something. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. What I felt, mostly, was sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that Rosaria had spent 5 years making herself my adversary when she didn't have to. Sad that Franco had felt he needed to protect me in secret rather than simply being able to say, openly, treat my daughter-in-law with the respect she deserves. That sadness was real. It sat alongside everything else. But I also felt, underneath it, something I can only describe as solid, grounded. Like I had been standing on uncertain terrain for a long time without knowing it, and now I knew exactly where the ground was. Commerce Drive turned out to be a good property to own. The tenants were stable. The management was straightforward. I hired a property manager in North Bay, and we developed an easy working relationship. The income from the leases allowed Daniel and me to move forward on something we had been holding gently, carefully, for 2 years. The adoption process. We had made the decision together, in the quiet way we made most important decisions, talking about it in small pieces over time, until one day we looked at each other and realized we had already decided. We began the paperwork in the spring. It was a long process, as it is for everyone, full of forms and interviews and home studies and waiting. But we moved through it with the same steadiness we had brought to everything else. I think about Franco sometimes when I'm being impatient with the timeline. I think about him saying, I've learned not to trust later. And then I think, but also, some things take the time they take. Some things you cannot rush without breaking them. Franco knew that too. He waited 14 months to tell me. He waited until the moment was right. In early autumn, almost 2 years after the will reading, we brought our daughter home. She was 14 months old. Her name, the name we chose for her, is Francesca, which was not subtle and was entirely intentional. She has a way of looking at things that is very steady and very serious, and then breaking into a smile that makes the whole room rearrange itself. Daniel's aunts, Carmela and Luisa, came to meet her. They cried. Carmela held her for a long time and whispered things in Italian that I didn't understand but felt the warmth of completely. Rosaria has not met her yet. That door is not closed. It is simply waiting, the way some things have to wait, until the conditions are right and the ground is solid enough to stand on. I am not the one who closed it. I am also not in a hurry to force it open. What I know is this: family is not a thing you inherit automatically. It is not conferred by blood alone or by legal documents or by who sits in whose chair at whose table. Family is built, deliberately, by people who choose each other every day even when that choosing is hard. Franco Marchetti understood that. He chose to see me. He chose to acknowledge me. He chose to protect me in the most lasting way he knew how, not with words, which can be disputed, but with a registered deed at the land registry office, which cannot. I am 34 now. I have a husband who holds my hand on highway drives. I have a daughter who is figuring out how stairs work with an intensity that I find both terrifying and wonderful. I have a building on Commerce Drive, with 11 tenants, and a property manager who sends me updates every month. I have a father-in-law I never got enough time with, whose absence I feel at odd moments when I drive past a certain kind of gray October sky, when I pour a cup of coffee in a quiet office and the afternoon light falls a particular way through the window. And I have this, which I want to say clearly, because I think it is the part worth keeping. Dignity is not something other people can take from you. They can try through small cruelties and pointed silences and comments, shaped just precisely enough to hurt without leaving a mark. They can try for years. But dignity is not stored in their approval. It is not contingent on whether they offer it or withhold it. It lives in you. In the choices you make quietly. In the way you handle yourself when the room is watching and when it isn't. Franco saw mine. He reflected it back to me on a gray Thursday in September, with a cup of coffee and a plain brown envelope, and the words, "What I am giving you is not charity, it is acknowledgement." In Canada, as in most places, we talk a lot about family values. But values are not what you say at the dinner table. They are what you do when it costs you something. They are what you protect when protection is inconvenient. They are what you acknowledge when acknowledgement requires courage. Be that person for the people in your life who need it. Do it while you can. Do not trust later as much as you used to. If you are in a family that makes you feel like a visitor in your own life, know that that feeling is information, not fact. It tells you about them. It does not define you. And if there is someone in your life who sees you clearly, who reflects your worth back to you without condition, hold on to that. Learn from it. Become it, for someone else, when it's your turn. That is the only legacy that cannot be contested.